So thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to actually be in person giving a talk. I haven't done this in quite a while in person, so it's just so invigorating. Warning that I will be talking about healthy goals and healthy eating, so I hope it doesn't interfere with your pizza. So kind of to get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the problem that I'm working on. And so I wanted to introduce Ray. She's a 30-year-old mom, and she wants to be more physically active. And she's actually fits in well in the crowd among American adults. About half of adults set goals to exercise more, eat healthier every single year. Like, how many of you have set a resolution to do any of those things? Oh, I'm sure there's like a lot more of you. But it's really challenging to actually engage in health behaviors. So there's a really big gap between people's intentions and actually implementing those behaviors. 6 months in, about 50% of people who set New Year's resolutions are off track with them. Some people take over 5 years to actually maintain New Year resolutions. And this is not just like an individual problem. It actually, such behaviors like exercise, eating healthy, lead to a lot of chronic diseases that are preventable through health behaviors like diabetes or heart disease. So it's really important to actually be able to help people engage in these behaviors that we all aspire to do. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why is this challenging. So there are many challenges that people encounter when they set health goals. So for Ray, who wanted to exercise more, she wonders like what activities she could do. She's not sure whether she should start walking or running. Doesn't know what's really beneficial for her to be in terms of different types of activities. Doesn't quite know when to fit it into her schedule. Doesn't really know what's feasible on a day-to-day basis. Like, there are a lot of barriers that come in the way of people engaging in health behaviors. But there are actually ways to help people. There are a lot of evidence-based interventions, behavioral interventions, that when people engage in them, they have better health outcomes. They exercise more, they're healthier, their mental health improves, and so on. And there are two keys to helping people engage in health behaviors, is that whatever it is that the intervention people engage in with needs to be tailored to their everyday needs. Otherwise, people won't do it. We all know design here, but it has to be designed for people's needs. And then there's a lot of evidence-driven interventions, right? They're proven to work in health research over and over. But again, why is it difficult to engage with this? So for example, Ray, what she could do is decide that she will do yoga poses 2 times a day as prescribed by her PT, right? It follows recommendations from her doctor, figures out when to do them 5 minutes a day during her baby nap while partner watches her baby, kind of figures out good opportunities to do this. And so a plan like this could really work for her. Now, what happens in practice is that people don't actually know how to set goals, effective goals. A lot of the time, people are overly ambitious. When people do set goals and they create plans for their everyday life, they're not anchored in time, they're not anchored in situations. When they're going to enact those actions, people don't actually have domain knowledge about exercise, diet, and so on. And so that creates a lot of barriers in actually engaging in healthy behaviors. Okay, so what do we do now? There is a way forward. So people can actually get a lot of support to engage in healthy behaviors. And so a lot of people might talk to nutritionists, exercise trainers, mental health providers. And these people are trained to provide high quality advice. We're going to watch for that pizza. These people are trained to provide high quality advice, but they're really expensive, right? So that can be hard to access. And that's where technology comes in. So there's an estimated 300,000 apps that advertise having some health connection, providing some sort of health support. So right, that offers a lot of promise in helping people manage health goals. But what I'll actually show you is that the technology actually is not actually meeting the promised bars. So a lot of the apps out there have limited, they don't engage with evidence-based practices much. So out of about 10,000 mental health apps that are being downloaded, most of them do not actually follow evidence-based guidelines. So effective treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy and other interventions that are known to help people manage their mental health. Out of the most popular exercise apps out there, most of them don't actually meet the national guidelines from the American College of Sports Medicine. And a lot of the apps actually don't meet a lot of behavior change, so don't incorporate a lot of behavior change techniques that are known to be effective. So there's a lot of effective evidence-based treatments and techniques out there, but they're not actually incorporated in a lot of the apps that currently exist. Yes.
A quick question, just when we talk about how proliferation of apps are like clearly doing these things that are not great, right? There's a difference though between apps that aren't doing a good job, like following the evidence. Like I can tell you to do a thing that maybe we thought was effective, but really it has no real impact. Versus like apps that are actively doing harmful things.
Right,
like,
right.
This action that I'm telling you to do actually is going to make everything worse, and you have to do that. Yes. That's the case. So is this mostly about the former? This is mostly about apps that we don't have great evidence. We don't have like good reason to believe that they'll work.
So these research studies basically look at like current evidence and whether it's met by the apps. But as designers, we know that actually when we implement things in technology, we might have to modify those interventions, and they might turn out to be different. These studies that I'm citing also don't necessarily look at whether things are effective despite not being evidence-based. And so there are actually various debates in, say, for example, the mental health community where there are discussions like apps might not actually have to incorporate the evidence-based treatment, with high fidelity to be helpful, right? They can be helpful even though they're not perfectly meeting the evidence. But a lot of the apps are actually, they're still like not drawing on things that we know are helpful. There's a lot of translation work that needs to be done, and I'll kind of touch on that. So we have a lot of work to do on this front, incorporating evidence-based practice. And then our current technology is like incorporating people's everyday needs. So I want to give you a couple of examples of ways in which technology is not really tailored to people's context and background. So if we look, for example, at exercise apps, some popular exercise apps, does the Nike app, provides people with a list of exercise routines. It's great if you don't know anything, but it's actually, these are generic and they're not actually aligned to like a person's needs, their pain points, and what they like doing or what they're able to do. Apps are not really contextualized to what actually works for people. So MyFitnessPal, for example, will give tips for like wake up 10 minutes earlier to do some physical activity. That obviously won't necessarily fit into everyone's life, but there's no way to actually account for that as part of the app. You'll get that recommendation regardless. Apps are trying to collect data about people so that they tailor their recommendations, but the types of onboarding they have are actually very limited and are mostly based on demographics, or like how many times a week do you exercise, or fairly generic goals like I want to lose weight. The goals people can set are typically, they might be adjustable, but the default is set the same for everyone. And so that means that if you actually are not a 10,000 step walker, you might feel like you're failing all the time and then give up on your goals. And apps don't really account for people's everyday like patterns. So for example, if you look at this person, you might see that on weekends, they're actually meeting their goal, but not the rest of the time. So that tells us something about when that goal is appropriate for them and when it's not. But again, apps are kind of static and don't accommodate for those different daily patterns people have. And so with that, I'm getting to what I'll talk about in the rest of the talk, which is how to support people's health goals with evidence-based technologies that are aligned with everyday needs. And I will do that after you grab pizza. Cool. Well, I hope you are all happier now that you're filling up the tummies. So for the rest of the talk, I will walk through 3 different projects that kind of highlight these tensions of incorporating evidence-based practice from health research into technology and incorporating people's lived experiences. And so I'll start with the first project, which looks at designing tailored evidence-based tools for physical activity. Right, so earlier I was telling you about this tension of like, do we reach out to experts? They're expensive. Do we reach out to apps? They're limited in the content they have. But even experts, actually, going back to them, like they're really good at the treatments, evidence-based practice, but research actually shows that they're not as good at it, providing support that aligns with people's lived experiences. In fact, people who are better at that are our peers, people with similar lived experiences. So that could be friends, family, or online peers. So there's an increase in online communities where people seek support for their health goals, or connecting even with friends and family through online communities. But it's still very challenging to leverage the expertise of these people. And so in this project, what I want to talk about is a discussion kind of how can social connections, whether they're familiar with us, like friends and family, or complete strangers like online crowds or online peers, how can they provide tailored evidence-based support for health goals? And here I'm going to touch on like kind of findings we had from a series of studies we ran on this topic. And I'll first talk about how different people tailor their support in different ways. And probably will only mostly, in the interest of time, focus on that. So a lot of the times, people need to actually put a lot of effort into getting the support they need. So if you think of online communities, this is a screenshot from Instagram. In one of the studies we ran, we looked at how people seek support for healthy eating on Instagram. And people get a lot of support from these communities. They find information about like new recipes that they can cook that align better with their needs, alternative ingredients, new approaches to staying healthy, a lot of accountability, a lot of other good things. But people actually have to put a lot of effort into getting this information, curating an entire audience, searching for this content and kind of filtering through it. And so one of the things we did in my work is we looked at, well, why don't we just bring these health resources to people more easily? And so we kind of drew on kind of the idea of on-demand services and crowdsourcing platforms where you can actually kind of request help from a lot of people for all sorts of personal tasks. And these platforms have actually increasingly also focused on the health domain. So there are tools for crowdsourcing mental health support or dietary information. And so what we wanted to understand is, to what extent can other people provide kind of behavioral recommendations? And to what extent are those tailored? Can they be tailored to a person's everyday needs, and can draw on evidence, health evidence? And we looked at this actually across of different domains like exercise, eating healthy. We actually also looked at finances. And the scope of this project was like, let's ask people to provide recommendations for like a 1-week plan what should I do in the next week to work towards my goal? So that can just be like, it's almost could be a schedule, you know, day by day, time, what activity should I do? Maybe how should I do it? And so I want to share a couple of findings from what we learned from this. Different people have different abilities to tailor their recommendations. So friends do particularly better than crowd members, for example. This might not be surprising. Friends kind of know us, so they should tailor their recommendations better to us. But what we find is actually that if we give crowd members kind of a 1-week diary of a person's behavior and what they do for exercise, for diet, they can actually learn a lot about that person. And after seeing a 1-week diary, they actually tailor their recommendations significantly better. And when we ask participants, they actually say, like, I feel like this person knew me. They knew what I like to do. I like to shop, and they knew what was important, even though they had no connection with each other except for this 1-week diary. So with some information, like complete strangers can actually tailor their support. But there's still a lot of improvement, right? We can't just ask a complete stranger to tailor behavioral recommendations and them to do an immediate good job. And even like friends and family, people ask support from people who knew them for more than 5 years, right? So you'd think they knew actually a lot about their life. But even those friends and family members still felt like they didn't know quite the everyday routines of the person they were helping in order to incorporate that support really in a way that was meaningful to the everyday life of that person. And so the kind of key pieces of information that were important for tailoring behavioral support were knowing more about people's goals, their preferences, their routines, and constraints. Let's skip this part. And so, although information is really important, people actually are very reluctant to share that information. So people would feel uncomfortable sharing information about their everyday life with their friends. So a person said, I would feel embarrassed for my friend to know how infrequently I'm actually sitting down for a meal. So this might seem like a pretty casual piece of information. Many of us don't sit down for a meal, but this felt uncomfortable to share with someone who knew them, even though perhaps there was no judgment involved. And instead, people prefer to actually disclose information with people they don't know, like crowd members. Participants felt like they don't know me, they can't really judge me. And even if they do, it's not like I'll really know about it. It's just easier to share that information. So kind of to address some of and other challenges we found, we actually designed a tool that enabled people with no formal like exercise training and no knowledge, the people they were helping them originally, to provide exercise recommendations that were evidence-based and tailored. And so we kind of built on what we learned previously and build a rich user profile that kind of through iterations we figured out should have kind of people's long and short-term goals, what they have access to, what they like, what they're interested in, what are their previous experiences with the behavior they engage in. And by creating the sort of rich profile, that enabled people giving recommendations to tailor them much better. So for example, if we raise actually an actual participant in our study, and if you look at her constraints, she said, I have a nursing 6 months old that hasn't been sleeping well and is sucking every ounce of energy out of me, literally time constraints, pregnancy constraints, energy depletion. She talks about liking Pilates, but not liking running because it hurts her knees as she gets bored. So like all this contextual information, not just like the activities that the person liked or disliked, provided a lot more insight to people in providing recommendations that are better aligned with raised needs. And it actually led to creating highly tailored recommendations. We actually tested this with both experts like exercise fitness instructors who provided recommendations and complete novices, and they both performed like equally well at this task. So that's kind of an example of how we can build templates and elicit information about a person's life that enables this sort of high and rich tailoring to their everyday needs. So next, I want to touch a little bit on like why following evidence-based guidelines is difficult for people, which is also a component of this research line. And so I want to give you an example of an evidence-based guideline. So physical activity guidelines say that people should exercise a minimum at 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity a week. Which of you know if you're doing that or can interpret this information, feel like you know what this means? Okay, so some of you, it has minutes, it has a bunch of familiar elements. And there are a bunch of other guidelines. I won't go through them. But it's actually a pretty complex guideline. In fact, it's based on the energy expenditure we have. And so although we're all doing the same activity of sitting right now, each of us consumes different amounts of energy. And if we were to start walking at the same speed, we would actually consume different energy, which would translate in different amounts of minutes of high or low intensity of physical activity. So these are actually can be quite difficult to interpret for people if we just tell them that. And so not only are they difficult to interpret when we ask people to make recommendations for physical activity, what we learned is that people who are novices and are not trained in this types of exercise guidelines will, for example, overprescribe the amount of exercise they recommend to other people, or how much they push people in making progress compared to what experts recommend. So if you feel like you have an exercise buddy that's pushing you too hard, that might actually be true. And so what we did is we actually scaffolded a bunch of these exercise guidelines, working with an exercise scientist and trying to interpret those into, translate them into representations that are familiar to people. So for example, if you're to schedule an exercise activity, you could get feedback on instead of intensity of minutes, calories consumed, or how much cardio and strength is being prescribed, and kind of get feedback as you can build an exercise routine on how well you're doing in terms of various types of guidelines in a way that's more interpretable by people who are not experts. And overall, by translating some of these guidelines and providing feedback on how well people are doing at their recommendations, it actually improves the quality of advice that they provide, so that it's more in line with evidence-based guidelines. And in some dimensions, they actually do as well as experts, specifically fitness instructors that were performing the same task. So kind of with this project, I wanted to highlight the value of kind of identifying different types of information related to how we can better tailor recommendations for behavioral support, right? And how different people might have different abilities in providing tailored support. And that there are techniques through which we can translate evidence-based practices in ways that people can learn to implement or recognize them. Let's see. Okay, so kind of moving on, I wanted to expand a little bit more on this aspect of tailoring, right? I talked about exercise goals, which kind of might seem like a fairly fixed type of goal, as we kind of all know what it means. But then we actually studied how people set goals in the context of mental health. And it turns out those goals are a lot more complex and difficult to design for. And so I'll talk a little bit about how technology can tailor support for this very multifaceted, very complex and longitudinal goals for mental health. And this is work that's if we had a CSCW in person, would be presented next week, but it isn't virtually. And so what I kind of want to highlight how mental health goals are a bit different than other types of goals. So, exercise goals, you could think of them as things that are quantifiable, amounts, types of activities one might do, numbers of steps they walk, and technologies are actually really good at capturing these quantifiable goals. But many of the goals people set in their everyday life for mental health are much more complex. There are things like relationship management, being happy, living healthy. And so these are fairly abstract and complex. And so we wanted to study this context to better understand what's lacking in the design of technologies for these types of goals. And so we actually study this in the context of mental health therapy. Their goal setting and planning is a core component of many behavioral mental health therapies, and an effective technique to actually improve depression and anxiety symptoms. And we looked at this, how therapists and clients set goals over 9 weeks to support people's mental health. So I want to tell you a couple of things that we learned from that. And I'll actually talk about this with respect to a model that we developed on how people select, simplify, and adjust their goals over time. So first, kind of wanted to reemphasize that what we saw is that people, when they think about mental health goals, they actually manage multiple goals at the same time. Things like employment, relationships, building social connections, managing loss, exercising, doing chores, and many more. And if you feel like some of these don't fit into mental health, they actually do relate to people's mental health, their anxiety or depression. So they were goals across kind of a different spectrum of areas of a person's life. Not only do people manage multiple of such goals at the same time, these are complex and not necessarily easy to resolve and figure out what to do next about them and figure out what to address about these goals. And so clients and therapists actually go through a lengthy process of reflection and of understanding people's problems in order to address any single of these goals. Oh, and these goals also evolve and change over time. So they're not even static. So that poses a lot of challenges, like how do we design for this? So part of this research was kind of aimed to understand what are some of the processes that are being used so that we are more able to tackle these really complex goals using technology. And so I'll kind of talk through a few processes. So for example, because people had a lot of goals at the same time, one of the things that was a challenge was choosing what should I work on any single week, and how do I select from that? So there are actually multiple strategies therapists and clients use, like identifying what's controllable by the person, what's aligned with their values, revisiting past problems, anticipating future problems. So for example, an example of a situation was that a person said, kids stopped talking to her. The client refused to let her see her grandkids. She had no control over that. She couldn't change that certain situation, although that was her goal. So then we worked on something different, on a lot of stress management, things that she could control. So understanding the person's desire was to see her grandchildren, they kind of had to pivot to a very different type of goal that the person could actually manage. So if you think of this in terms of designing technology, right, this involves a lot of information that would be hard to elicit if the person's goal is to see their grandchildren, to kind of jump into actually like stress management as one of the solutions for that. Or the therapist, right, is actually an assistant in this entire process where they're actually learning and monitoring a lot of things about their client. So one of the things they might do is actually monitor past problems. So this therapist told us he has problems in all categories: loneliness, feeling too sedentary, his diet, and he always picks those to focus on. But then it feels like we're talking about around the bigger issue of, should I leave my wife or not? Right. So that assistant kind of has this holistic view of the client and is able to bring up things that are important at the right time. Or anticipating future problems that also turn into goals. So a partner's leaving town, I'm really anxious, so this is something important to prepare for, and trying to find activities to address that particular issue. Right. So there's so many different things that feed into kind of managing week by week mental health of a person. So I might jump over some of these aspects because I think I'm going to constrain the time for the pizza digestion. So again, these goals that I've mentioned, right, they're really complex. So therapists and clients use a lot of mechanisms to just simplify these goals, like understanding, for example, how problems manifest. So right, the therapist learns about their clients and what their behavior is outside of therapy. For example, this client said, I tend to go to my bedroom and lay on my bed, and then I realize that I've been on my bed for several hours. But then the therapist is able to draw on past experiences that the person shared. Like they mentioned that they really enjoy walking, gardening, being outside. So we'll talk about what could you do instead of going into your room and laying down. That might be some of those activities. So again, it's leveraging a lot of information that the therapist actually collects about a person on that front. And I guess the last thing we see therapists and clients do is a lot of adjustment of goals that change as the client understands their problems better and learns new skills to cope with their problems. So for example, a therapist said, a lot of clients are taking steps to do something you've never done before. Like a woman, she had never told anyone she was mad at them. This is an older adult. Her whole life, being passive and never said a word to somebody like, I'm mad at you. So it's a wide range of skills that the clients need to learn in order to be able to address mental health goals. So unlike exercise, where maybe you have to become familiar with a certain activity, because mental health spanned all these different domains, like therapists actually needed to facilitate skills across a wide range of areas. So kind of one of the things I wanted to take away from this project was that right, technologies need to be better at supporting a lot of multiple and evolving goals that people have. Currently, a lot of technologies might be disconnected from each other. We might have an exercise app, a sleep app, but these technologies don't actually integrate across different aspects of people's lives and what they prioritize at different times, how they might continuously work on their goals or might disconnect from them and then re-engage later. It's helpful to be able to reflect not only in the past situations, but also upcoming situations in a person's life. A lot of reflection in technology is very past oriented, but the future and anticipating those situations is really important as well. It's really complex. In mental health, we deal with really complex goals. So technology needs to be able to help people break down those goals more. And that's actually really complicated as we were surfacing in the therapist practice. And these goals are not static. They just constantly change and they get adjusted, which is, again, also something that with technology, we're not actually emphasizing a lot in the design. So maybe I want to touch also on this last piece. So I'll touch on it briefly. And what I also want to bring in is that to create these technologies, they're not created just by designers. Health technologies are often created by designers, also bringing in health researchers in. And so that was not always the case. In fact, if we look at research funding from NIH for health research, there's an increase in the use of human-centered design in health research projects. So that's just has been increasing over the last 10 years, and we're still figuring out how to do this kind of cross-disciplinary work where we combine expertise from design or HCI with health expertise. And so what I want to highlight is that it's actually really difficult to do collaborations across fields and incorporate design work and health research at the same time. So all these things that I've been presenting, there's a reason it's hard to build these technologies. And so we've actually studied, we've interviewed HCI researchers and health researchers who worked in teams where they collaborated in building health technologies to understand their experiences in working together. And we kind of use a lens of scientific collaboration in studying that. Scientific collaboration is really hard. Part of why it's hard is because team success doesn't just depend on the team members. It actually depends on a lot of the circumstances that those team members exist in. So, for example, for a science team to be successful, it depends on the abilities of its team members, but also their interpersonal skills, their training, and then a team's existence, like people actually working together, might depend on whether they have institutional incentives to work together, whether they have funding to work together. So teams actually operate in a complex ecosystem that impacts whether people will even find each other to work together and how well they'll do that. And so, again, this would be a CSEW highlight from CSEW 2022. In case you're not attending, I'm going to give you a highlight now. So we have a paper looking at how the challenges that usually early and mid-career HCI and health researchers have been working together. And so I'll highlight just a couple of them. Why it's hard to even create these technologies. So first of all, it's hard for people to even find each other. Design and health researchers operate in kind of different parts of institutions. It takes a lot of individual effort for teams to form. Some people spend multiple years trying to find a collaborator for their work by leveraging a lot of institutional resources and human resources. So there's a lot of high burden on individuals to form these teams. And when there are institutional structures to facilitate them, like seed funding, that becomes easier, or cross-disciplinary like programs, that becomes easier, but most institutions might not have that. So it's really hard for teams to even come together to build these technologies. When they do come together, looking at the HCI perspective of things, the HCI researcher's role is often misunderstood by health researchers. So they are either seen as a practitioner, somebody who like redesigns things, a programmer, somebody who can make an application that the health researcher envisioned, or a usability tester who comes in at the end. So that makes it hard to work together and conceive research together. Funding agencies also don't actually set good expectations around that because we're not used to doing this cross-disciplinary work. Again, methods are not the same across fields. So for example, health researchers don't always recognize qualitative work. Some health researchers might see qualitative work as anecdotes or creativity. That also creates challenges in working together. And then health researchers might actually care a lot about translating the research into practice, for example, into clinical settings, but that's not always incentivized in the HCI or design world, where there's a lot of focus on innovation rather than, say, using old technologies for health problems. So that's just to highlight a little bit that it's really hard to actually create these technologies that I've been talking about, because the people who could create them can have a hard time working together because there are not a lot of aligned incentives and aligned like methodologies. And there are approaches to kind of, we can learn a lot from team science, which has studied cross-disciplinary teams across other fields. And so there are ways to like build training programs where people work together more closely to reward translational work. There are communication tools people can use that can make it easier to do this type of collaborative work, but we're not there yet. So there's a lot more work to be done on that front. So with that, I'll just wrap up here and mostly kind of highlight that I think it's really important to make sure we support the people who are creating these technologies to be able to both draw on evidence-based practice, which a lot of health researchers create, but also incorporate people's lived experiences. And we need kind of better tools and approaches to actually be able to draw on both of them. And I kind of showed some of the things we're uncovering in our work on how that actually instantiates in practice. With that, I will wrap up here. Thank you.